through her earbuds. And Casey's several seats away with his brother on the other side of the plane. And that evening, when they arrive at their hotel, she said Casey used his letterboard to describe the entire episode she had heard. And she said, I was completely blown away.
Let's go to the telepathy tapes. That's exactly where I wanted to go next. Can you lay out sort of what exactly they are if the listener at home is not familiar at all about the telepathy tapes? Can you kind of walk us through this step by step?
Sure. So first of all, I should say the way that I got involved in it was that I was contacted by Diane Hennessy Powell, who's a neuropsychiatrist who's been doing work with kids with telepathy for a number of years. And she's a friend of mine from a lot of the societies that we're in. And then Kai Dickens, and they said, would you be willing to be on an episode of the telepathy tapes? And I said, well, sure. And so what I didn't know about telepathy and autism. That wasn't one of my areas I'd done research in. But so she said, would you please go on the site and look at the previous 3 episodes? And nobody asked me to do that. You didn't ask me to watch 3 of your episodes before I came on. I was a little bit surprised, taken aback. But at the last minute that morning before my interview, I went ahead and went to the site. And as soon as I started watching, I could not stop. It was that amazing. And I then watched I probably 2 and 2.5 of the episodes before my interview. And then when we got on, it's like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. So I think that there's, first of all, that interesting thing that I couldn't believe it until I really heard these interactions. And then it's like, well, I know Diane. I then went to the web to look up her articles. She had no articles in peer-reviewed journals like, I don't know, whether Explore or Science or something like that on this topic. And so I went to Diane. I said, Diane, you've been doing this for a long time. You have to have articles out to convince people. Where are your articles? And well, she is a clinical neuropsychiatrist. Her job, as far as she's concerned, is to show this is the case, but she's not somebody that, publishes day and night because she's not associated with the university. So I said, Diane, let me help you. I'm a neuroscientist that loves to write papers. So basically, she and Marina Weiler, who's at the University of Virginia, another neuroscientist, have formed now a collaboration where we are now publishing the data from these 3 different video tape data sets that she had gathered, and they're powerful. So I guess the point is that that's what got me interested in it. So then I began carefully going into the data. And what I discovered when I looked at these videos, and we were looking at them frame by frame, where the mother is in the cameras, there are often 2 cameras, where the child is, what the child's doing. In one case, they are at a keyboard, hitting the keyboard with the words that they believe they're seeing in their mother's head behind them, et cetera. We're actually looking at that and seeing, could there be any sensory leakage? How is it going on? And I should say what I was finding out is that with this one child, every time, so I'll just give you an example. So the researcher is showing the mother 5-digit numbers behind him. And we might be like 57832. Okay, so she's looking at that. And now he's starting to hit on the keyboard, looking directly in front of him. There's a little laptop computer. He's starting to hit the numbers, but he's not really good at hitting them. But when he sees the number, for example, 8, he says A. He doesn't say, though, he can't speak 8, but he's at A. And then when for 5, he says fa. For 6, he says sa. So you're hearing his intention. And he will make mistakes because he has apraxia. He can't hit the right key. And so he has to then try to hit the backspace, et cetera. But you can see his intention, and eventually he hits the right key. And with the 2 other kids, they don't have so much apraxia, and they're much, much better. But we have those kids, again, the evidence for those kids. So I saw those and I got really excited. So we are now writing a paper up. It's just about ready to be submitted with another man, Charles Yokoyama, who's a past editor of a well-renowned journal, Neuron, who also believes this phenomenon needs to get out. And we're hoping that we can get this into a credible journal, and so that people can really see the data and make their own opinions. But so saying that, I then said to Marina Weiler and to Diane, I want to do more research. I am fascinated. It's like, what I want to say is that the way I go into new research is literally because there's this compulsion from what I would call my heart that I want to know more. This is fascinating and I have to know. So then what Marina and I and Diane have been doing is collecting interviews, Zoom interviews with the parents and the children, the people that have responded to a social media announcement by Kai Dickens to say, would you be interested in being part of a study? And so then we hear the story of the children and the story of the parents. And we also have a 15-question questionnaire asking the children and the parents, for example, to the parents, when did you first know your child was telepathic? And the parents give their answer. And then we hear the child, when did you first know you were telepathic? And as I said earlier, the child says, well, I've always been telepathic from the moment I was born. And in some cases, we're even hearing about examples that appear to be prenatally, whatever we want to think about that. So that is one of the ways that it's happened. And I'll just give you a little bit of my own interactions now with these children. So Maria Welch is a speech therapist that's in Chicago that's working with a number of these children in her clinics every day. And we have begun working with her and learning more about it. And what your listeners may remember is that she actually has talked to Kai Dickens too. And we have talked to her, and she said that many years ago, she first found out that the children that were working with her seemed to be able to know what she was doing at other times of the day, even though it should be impossible. And they would share with her what she had done at home the night before. And this is a little invasive in terms of privacy, but they would mention that. And she then began talking to different ones, and they all had that ability. And then she asked them how they were doing that. And they mentioned the word, the hill. Again, that there's this place they go mentally to communicate with each other, and they call it the hill. And so she thought that was very interesting. And then later, when she was then talking to Kai Dickens, who had just been in Atlanta, Georgia, and had talked to a young man named Houston and his mother, Katie, Houston told Kai about the hill as well. Now, the kids in Chicago and Houston and his friends never have talked to each other, but they both call this place where they mentally converse the hill. To me, that's amazing. And they talked about, again, who they talked to on the hill, what it's like, etc. So that certainly began to intrigue me. And then when I began to actually talk to some of the kids a little bit more and their mothers, I just found out amazing things. And I'll give you one example again from this one child who's named Casey. And the reason why this is so interesting to me is that I got very interesting answers from him that I wouldn't have expected. And so I'm just going to share a little bit of that. And first of all, for people that don't know so much about autism. So he basically was diagnosed when he was like 3 years of age, after he had begun regressing after about 15 months of age. By regressing, we mean he's no longer talking to his parents. He no longer is giving eye contact with the parents. He's really like withdrawing inside his body. So he then is diagnosed with autism. And then from then on, because he can't write, he can't communicate, he can't speak, there's no way for him to communicate with people around him. So the school teachers consider him mentally retarded. They put him in a special ed classroom where he's just with a few other people, but also can't communicate. And he never really learns anything in school the classroom setting. But then about 2 years ago, what happens is Casey's life changes because his mother hears about a new program. In this case, is called Reach Every Voice, teaching the kids to communicate through a letterboard, which is what all has been happening now with these kids. And that's what changed his life. And suddenly his mom said that she was now practicing communicating with the letterboard at home. And she said he responded so well to me, and it didn't take long for him to really open up to the letterboard. And she said it's been an amazing blessing because now she sees all the gifts he really has. And I'm just going to give you one example so you can feel what it was like from these interviews. So during the final weeks of Casey's great-grandmother's life now, basically Casey spent a lot of time visiting his great-grandmother. And when he was spelling on the letterboard with his mother, she said he suddenly began naming the deceased ancestors who he said were waiting for Nana. And one of the names was his great-grandfather. And Casey then spelled the deceased relative's middle name correctly, even though his mother didn't know how to properly spell the name. So once again, I'm saying, okay, what do I do as a materialist with that? This kid is only able to communicate through a letterboard. He doesn't know anything about his great-grandfather that's on the other side, but he's telling his mother about this when his Nana is dying. And so can the brain do that? Yeah, I mean, I can't say that, yes, my brain has created this illusion for me and this dream for me, and I'm sort of like making this up, but um, I don't know the mechanism. That's all I can say. I don't know the mechanism, but this is typical of these kids. And when we asked him about communication, I want to tell you one more thing that I think was really interesting about the mother discovering his telepathy. So what's happening is now they are on a vacation trip at one point, and he has a brother as well, and they're on the plane riding there. And the mother happens to be listening for the first time to the Telepathy Tapes podcast through her earbuds. And Casey's several seats away with his brother on the other side of the plane. And that evening, when they arrive at their hotel, she said Casey used his letterboard to describe the entire episode she had heard. And she said, I was completely blown away. At first, I thought he was basically, he was like sensing my emotions. But when I asked him about it, he simply said, I hear it. He heard it inside of himself. And so she described experience after experience. I don't necessarily have to name others, but you could see that he has telepathy in situations where, like, his father was at work, like 5 hours away. And some major incident happened at work that was sort of upsetting. And he then tells his mother about it at home. And when the father comes home the next day, they corroborate that everything Casey said was true, that Casey knew that was happening at his father's work. So, how can that happen?
I don't know, but I would like to share my main concern with this, and it's actually not about telepathy. My main concern is about the vulnerable population of autism, the people on the autistic spectrum. So
Yeah.
whenever I hear autism being thrown in, I'm like, initially, I'm already skeptical because it's a great story, right? Autistic people possess this ability that other people don't. You know, it's just autism is in general involved in so much misinformation because it tells a good story. So I'm initially skeptical because these are vulnerable populations and struggling parents, you know, really struggling parents, people that are going through an emotionally difficult time, a psychologically tough time. I know I don't have to explain this to you. You've been around these people, so I totally get that you understand this. I'm cautious of those vulnerable populations being taken advantage of. That when Kai Dickens puts out the report saying we're looking for these people, that every mom and their nonverbal child is going to be like, oh my God, that's it. And maybe they fully believe it in their heart. And maybe it's true. I don't know. But I don't know necessarily why any of this has to actually do with autism. Like, have we ruled out the possibility that this is just a property of human beings and that the autism part isn't a story for the sensational part? Because I'm way less cautious about the telepathy thing. I'm like, go for it, let's study this. But then when autism is involved, I'm like, we need to be careful here, I think. And we need to have good reason to actually believe that it's associated with autism. And I'm not sure that work has really been done. So I'm curious on your thoughts there.
So here, I think those are good questions, but here's the reason for it. So do you know the name Dean Radin? Again, Dean Radin is at IONS, Institute of Noetic Sciences. He has been working on telepathy his entire career, and I think he's probably in his late 60s, early 70s now. The effect that they get in terms of looking at telepathy in the normal population is 5% above chance. That's all it is, 5% above chance. It's a little bit higher in really creative individuals. There's something about real creativity and also meditation, quieting those filters on the brain that makes you more able to be telepathic. But nobody will believe a change that is 5% above chance. They have all sorts of reasons that it's not true. And these kids, it looks like it is close to 100% or 100%, depending on the child. That's why Christoph Koch went, oh my God, this really would change the way I look at the world if this is really true. So why that is the case? Here's my own speculation. They have not been able to speak and all of their lives for all the reasons because they have neurodivergent brains. And therefore, I believe their filters on their brains have not basically become really, really loud compared to the rest of ours because it's important to have filters on your brain to communicate normally in life. I need those filters. So they don't have those. And so they've had these abilities all their life. Nobody's known about them until they begin to communicate, and then they find out they've had them. Another interesting thing for you to be aware of is the mothers are very protective of their children, very often. And before the child comes into the study, they ask the child, do you want to participate? And the children say, absolutely yes, because we want to let the world know our abilities. So it's not a parent saying, oh, I'm guessing that you have this, and why don't we see if we can, show it to people. It's the kid saying, I know I've had it. I've always had it. And I want the world to stop thinking that I am a mentally retarded no, child without agency. I have agency. That's the big word. And so what's happening, what Kai Dickens has done, which I believe is not taking advantage of the children, she is trying to show the speech pathology world that these children have agency because they believe that the parents are the ones that are creating this whole thing, and the speech therapists are the ones that are creating the whole thing by actually moving the letterboard around to make it look like the child is talking. And so what people now that are doing research like ourselves are trying to do is carefully, in a laboratory situation, show that the letterboard is not moving, even if the parent is holding it and the child is moving to each letter. There's no way that there could be a mother making this response. The only very interesting issue is that one reason that the speech pathology people thought this wasn't real in the past is because the children had telepathy. So if you give the therapist a word and you don't show it to the child, and you ask the child to actually say what a word was given to them, they can just as easily say the therapist's word because they know that was what the therapist was given. So you have to rule that out in future research to show that maybe some of the times they were giving the therapist's word on their letterboard was not because they don't have agency, but because they have mental telepathy. It's easy enough to look at that and decide what's really going on, if you're curious.
So that I guess the obvious question then is, why isn't there bigger data sets? Why haven't we really gotten rigorous at the protocol? Because when you research this, you kind of hear that the individual scientists are also sort of doubtful of the data. They're also a little bit skeptical of the protocol. They're like, I think I read that Diane is like not still claiming telepathy because she's like, there is flaws in the protocol. There is maybe, as you say, facilitated communication where there's an obvious flaw with the person that has the answer directing the board to the person. So why don't we just control for this? Why don't we create the most ironclad protocol where the biggest skeptic in the world just cannot find an issue with this? And why don't we get a really big data set and we say, like, here it is. It's recorded on video. Everything is ironclad. Here it is. Like, skeptic, you're arse off. Like, what are you going to say? Like, why hasn't that been done?
Here's the reason. And I'm hoping you can understand this. First of all, the children that we're working with right now are now adults. They were children when this started. They weren't even the whole idea of facilitated communication. These various new technologies didn't even exist when they were younger. They went through school, like until they were like in the 12th grade, not able to communicate. And then their mother finds this particular rapid communication technique. It's all those things have just been happening in the last, maybe I'd say 10 years or so. So first of all, why hasn't it happened before? Because nobody really knew until people began to give them this technology. And then what happened is that there was a setback when the Speech and Language Association said, wait a minute, there was some case of some therapist actually appearing to manipulate a child in some way by saying what they created what they said the child was thinking. And therefore there was a lawsuit and everything was shut down. And that shut down state is where most schools are today. And there's an interesting thing because there's a difference I've discovered now in talking to therapists in schools. If your school system has an occupational therapist that is in charge of the special education program, occupational therapists are interested in motor control. I was a researcher in physical therapy, like occupational therapy, for many years. They want the children to be able to become have their own agency and be able to communicate. The speech people are coming from that different perspective from those lawsuits in the past, and they believe none of this is real. So the speech people don't want this communication. They don't want the kids to learn it because they don't believe in it. The occupational therapists believe in it, and they're having amazing things happening in their schools. So this is the funny thing about our society and our culture. So this is newer, and this is beginning to happen more and more. And, when Diane Hennessy Powell was actually on, I think this was an interview with a skeptic. And the skeptic, Diane said, really put words into Diane's mouth, and she was very unhappy. I think what Diane was saying is that we don't know really yet because we haven't controlled these carefully. Diane was doing her best in these 3 case studies, but we can't rule it out completely until we do what you're talking about is very careful studies. So Diane, Marina, and myself are going to Maria Welch's clinic in Chicago, and we're going to have the children wear eye tracking glasses so that we're controlling where the children are looking before they hit. We're going to have the therapist, for example, in a different room from the child, reading out something in their mind and then coming back in and seeing if the child can on their letterboard say those things. So we're doing exactly what we should be doing because we're scientists. We care. We want to know this is true, but it's just starting. Why hasn't it happened yet? Diane has been looking at the research, but she was a clinical neuropsychiatrist. She was not somebody in a research laboratory able to spend 24/7 on research. So basically, yes, the reviewer was a skeptic and trying to put words in Diane's mouth. And Diane was simply saying, look, I am a scientist. I'm a neuropsychiatrist, and I want the truth as well.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel